A drawer in a museum held the proof for over 50 years. Nobody opened it. Nobody knew what it meant. And once you see what was inside, you'll never look at ancient fire the same way again. If you've already watched a video about ancient humans and smoking, and there's a good chance you have because there are dozens of them out there right now, all pulling from the same 5 or 6 facts, this is not that video. Everything in the next few minutes is either something those videos left out, something that got discovered too recently for them to include, or something buried in a research paper that never made it into a script at all. That drawer, by the way, is real, and we're getting to exactly what was inside it. Some of what you're about to hear was published within the last 12 months. And one piece of it is going to force you to rethink which species actually started this whole behavior in the first place, because it might not have been us. Stick around because the ending connects all of it in a way that, honestly, most people miss entirely. Let's set the stage quickly because you need the foundation even if part of it sounds familiar. About 1 million years ago, at a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, early humans, specifically Homo erectus, were already building controlled fires deep inside a cave system and doing it consistently, not as a one-off accident but as a repeated, deliberate behavior. Archaeologists found burnt plant ash and charred bone in layers that stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. That means every single ancestor who sat near one of those fires was inhaling smoke, constantly, unavoidably, for their entire life. There was no choice involved. It was simply what happened when you lived near fire. But here's the detail that changes everything about how we read that fact. Some of what was burning in those fires wasn't just wood. Depending on what grew nearby, some of that smoke carried psychoactive compounds, alkaloids, and terpenes released when certain plants combust. And the human brain wasn't a blank slate reacting to something foreign. We already had receptors built specifically to respond to those compounds, part of what's called the endocannabinoid system, a network that regulates mood, memory, and appetite, and had been sitting in our biology long before anyone ever burned a plant on purpose. So the first time an ancestor inhaled the wrong smoke and felt something unusual, their brain wasn't confused. It recognized the signal. That's the seed this entire story grows out of. Everything after this point is really just humanity slowly, unevenly figuring out how to recreate that accident on purpose. Now, here's where we leave the part you might already know. In 2020, a team of researchers went back to an archaeological site called Tel Arad in the Negev desert in southern Israel, a fortress and shrine that had actually been excavated back in the 1960s. Inside the shrine's inner chamber, the part archaeologists call the Holy of Holies, sat 2 stone altars. On top of each one was a dark, hardened residue that nobody at the time had the technology to identify. For over 50 years, that residue just sat there, cataloged but unexplained, while the altars themselves were rebuilt and displayed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Then, using modern chemical residue analysis at 2 separate unrelated laboratories, that silence finally broke. The larger altar held frankincense, mixed deliberately with animal fat to help the resin evaporate slowly and steadily. The smaller altar held something nobody expected in a biblical-era shrine: cannabis. Mixed with animal dung, specifically because dung burns at a lower, gentler heat than wood, which means whoever prepared that altar understood exactly how to control the temperature so the psychoactive compounds would release as smoke instead of simply burning away. This wasn't hemp used for rope or fiber. The concentration of THC in that residue was high enough that anyone in that small stone room, breathing that smoke during a ceremony, would have felt its effects directly. The shrine dates to roughly 760 BC during the reign of the Kingdom of Judah, and this discovery is now the earliest confirmed physical evidence of cannabis being deliberately burned in a religious ritual anywhere in the ancient Near East. The lead researcher on the study put it plainly: this is the first time cannabis has been identified in this region's ancient religious practice, and its use in that shrine must have played a central role in the ceremonies performed there. Take a moment to actually sit with that. Priests, inside one of the most textually documented religious traditions in human history, building a deliberate psychoactive haze into their most sacred rituals, not as an accident, not as a side effect of incense, but as the entire point of the offering. And that raises a question worth pausing on before we move forward. If a kingdom studied as thoroughly as ancient Judah could keep a secret like that sitting under glass in a museum for over 50 years simply because nobody had the right test yet, what else has already been excavated, already sitting in a storage room somewhere, just waiting for someone to finally run the right chemical analysis on it? Because that exact scenario played out again, somewhere else entirely, just very recently. In 2025, archaeologists working on Bronze Age burials in central Thailand tried something nobody had really attempted before at this level of precision. Instead of relying on the old method, checking teeth for the reddish-black staining that chewing betel nut typically leaves behind, they went after something invisible to the naked eye: dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up on teeth over a person's lifetime, which, it turns out, can trap chemical evidence for thousands of years. Using a process called liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, researchers analyzed calculus samples from 6 separate burials at a site called Nong Ratchawat. In one individual, buried roughly 4,000 years ago, they detected aracholine, the specific psychoactive alkaloid found in betel nut, a mild stimulant that produces alertness and a light euphoric buzz, still chewed across parts of Asia and the Pacific today. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. That individual's teeth showed absolutely none of the telltale staining archaeologists have relied on for decades to identify betel nut chewers. By every visual standard used in the field before this study, this person would have been recorded as someone who never touched the stuff. The chemistry told a completely different story than the eyes did, which means an unknown number of burials in Thailand and everywhere else in the world that were written off as showing no evidence of psychoactive plant use may simply have been examined with tools too blunt to catch it. The entire global picture of who used mind-altering substances in the ancient world might be built on incomplete data, not because the evidence isn't there, but because we only just developed a way to see it. Quick pause here. Because if this is the kind of history you actually want, the version that gets rewritten the moment somebody finally runs the right lab test, go ahead and subscribe now. This channel exists specifically to track down exactly that kind of update before it becomes common knowledge everywhere else. Now let's go somewhere almost no other video on this topic touches at all. South America. In 2008, archaeologists working at a rock shelter called Cueva del Chileno, high in the Bolivian Andes at roughly 13,000 feet elevation, uncovered a leather bundle buried alongside a human burial. Inside it were carved wooden snuffing tablets decorated with small human figures, a snuffing tube with actual human hair braided into it, llama bone spatulas, and, strangest of all, a small pouch stitched together from the snouts of 3 foxes. The bundle sat mostly unanalyzed for over a decade. Then, in 2019, researchers finally ran a detailed chemical analysis on residue scraped from inside that fox snout pouch, and what they found was staggering: traces of at least 5 separate psychoactive compounds in a single artifact. Cocaine and its metabolite, from coca leaves. Harmine, from a vine called Banisteriopsis caapi. Bufotenine, and dimethyltryptamine, compounds associated with the powerful hallucinogenic brew known today as ayahuasca. This bundle, made by the pre-Inca Tiwanaku culture roughly 1,000 years ago, represents the largest number of psychoactive substances ever recovered from a single archaeological find in South America. The lead researcher on the study said something that deserves repeating. This may be the first physical evidence that ancient South Americans were deliberately combining multiple plants together to produce something as complex and powerful as ayahuasca, a full millennium before anyone assumed that level of botanical sophistication existed. This wasn't guesswork. Whoever assembled that bundle understood which plants to combine, in what preparation, to produce a specific and repeatable altered state. That is not casual experimentation. That is applied pharmacology, practiced at 13,000 feet, 1,000 years before modern chemistry had a name for any of it. So now you've got 3 separate ancient societies on 3 different continents with no contact with each other whatsoever, all independently arriving at the same basic idea. Judah with cannabis and frankincense on a stone altar. Bronze Age Thailand with betel nut hidden in dental plaque. The Tiwanaku high in the Andes with a 5-compound cocktail sewn into a fox snout pouch. None of them read about it anywhere. None of them had a word for chemistry. And yet the underlying logic is identical every single time. Which brings us to the part of this story that changes who actually gets credit for starting it. Because the deliberate, informed use of a plant to change how the body feels didn't begin with Homo sapiens at all. At a cave called El Cedron in northern Spain, researchers extracted ancient DNA directly from the calcified dental plaque of Neanderthals, who lived somewhere between 47,000 and 50,000 years ago. One individual, who researchers determined was suffering from a visible dental abscess and an intestinal parasite that would have caused severe, debilitating diarrhea, had something unexpected preserved in his teeth. Genetic traces of poplar bark, which contains salicin, the exact natural compound the human body converts into salicylic acid, the active pain-killing ingredient in aspirin. And alongside it, traces of penicillium, the mold that decades later would become the foundation of the first true antibiotic. A Neanderthal, Invisible Pain, appears to have deliberately selected a specific, bitter, nutritionally worthless plant that happened to numb pain, alongside a mold that happened to fight infection. And this wasn't an isolated case. An earlier study at the very same cave found a different Neanderthal individual with traces of yarrow and chamomile embedded in their calculus. Two plants that offer essentially no food value but carry well-documented anti-inflammatory properties. In evolutionary terms, bitter taste is usually the body's built-in warning system for poison. These individuals ate the bitter plant anyway, apparently again and again, in a pattern that only makes sense if, on some level, they understood what that plant was actually doing for them. Sit with what that actually means for a second. Every single video about the history of smoking treats intentional plant use, choosing a specific substance for its effect on the body, as something Homo sapiens invented somewhere along the way. We didn't. It was already an established working behavior in an entirely different species of human before our lineage even had the chance to build on it. We didn't discover the idea of using a plant to change how the body feels. We inherited the instinct, or maybe more accurately, we happened to survive while the species that may have pioneered it did not. Neanderthals vanished roughly 40,000 years ago, taking an entire unwritten library of botanical knowledge into extinction with them, which leads to an uncomfortable question worth actually asking. If Neanderthals could identify a natural painkiller and an antibiotic-producing mold with no writing system, no laboratory, nothing but generations of careful observation and memory passed from one individual to the next, how much of what later civilizations called medicine or called religion was really just this exact same instinct, quietly running in the background of every human culture that came afterward? Because when you follow that thread forward into recorded history, it holds up perfectly. In ancient Sumer, around 3400 BC, cuneiform tablets record the deliberate cultivation of the opium poppy, and the Sumerians had a name for it that translates roughly to the joy plant. Not a medicine in the clinical sense. A joy plant. That is the label an entire civilization chose for a substance whose defining effect was altering how a person felt. Centuries later, Egyptian physicians writing in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents on the planet, described inhaling medicinal smoke specifically to treat conditions of the throat and lungs. A treatment that sounds backward to modern ears but rests on logic that isn't crazy at all. The lungs deliver a substance directly into the bloodstream faster than swallowing anything ever could. We still use that exact principle today. Every time someone uses an inhaler for asthma or breathes in anesthetic gas before surgery, the delivery method never actually disappeared. It just got rebranded by modern medicine and stripped of the ritual that used to surround it. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine developed an entire practice called dhumapana, literally smoke drinking, involving specific herbs, specific pipes, and specific conditions, refined and documented over centuries, not improvised in the moment. There's one more piece of physical evidence worth putting on the table, because it comes from the same continent as tobacco itself, and it pushes the timeline back further than almost anyone expects. In 2019, researchers excavating in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah uncovered a hearth, a simple cooking and heating fire roughly 12,000 years old. Inside it were the charred seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species native to North America. These weren't seeds that had blown in by accident during a windstorm. Their concentration and placement suggested they had been deliberately thrown into the fire thousands of years before anyone in the region had pottery, pipes, or any of the tools normally associated with smoking. That single hearth pushed the plausible timeline of intentional tobacco use in the Americas back by thousands of years in one discovery. And it raises an obvious follow-up question nobody seems to ask out loud. If people were throwing tobacco into a fire in Utah 12,000 years ago, purely for the smoke, for ritual, or for both, what were people doing with their own local psychoactive plants at that exact same moment in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in Australia? 12,000 years ago, humans already occupied nearly every habitable continent on Earth. The drive we're describing wasn't confined to one hearth in one desert. It was almost certainly happening everywhere, simultaneously, completely independently, and we've only found the fraction of it that happened to survive in exactly the right soil conditions for exactly the right number of thousands of years. There's also a piece of this that isn't about the plants themselves at all. It's about why groups of humans kept doing this together instead of alone. For most of our species' existence, survival depended entirely on group cohesion. An isolated individual died. A tightly bonded group survived. And shared ritual, especially shared consumption of something that visibly altered everyone's state of mind at the same time, turns out to be one of the most powerful tools humans have for building exactly that kind of trust. Modern neuroscience has actually confirmed this in measurable terms. Shared ritual experiences synchronize neural activity across a group and measurably deepen feelings of trust and shared identity. So when a group of people sat inside a small stone shrine in Judah, or gathered around a fox snout pouch in the Bolivian Andes, and collectively entered an altered state together, that almost certainly wasn't just recreation. It was social infrastructure, built directly into ritual, engineered, whether they had a word for engineering or not, to hold a group together through everything else they had to survive. And then there's the part of this story that turns from remarkable into genuinely uncomfortable, because it shows exactly what happens when that entire multi-thousand-year framework of reverence, ritual, and careful knowledge gets stripped away. When tobacco reached Europe in the 16th century, it spread with a speed that should sound familiar to anyone who has watched a modern trend take over the internet overnight. Within decades, it went from an exotic curiosity to a continental obsession. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. By the early 1900s, the industrially manufactured cigarette had arrived, engineered specifically to be cheaper, faster, and more addictive than anything that came before it. What indigenous cultures in the Americas had spent thousands of years incorporating into disciplined, deeply meaningful ritual, European industrialists turned into a mass-market product in under 4 centuries. And through the 20th century, the tobacco industry spent decades and untold billions of dollars burying its own internal research showing that cigarettes caused cancer, while marketing directly to children and hiring doctors to publicly endorse the product. A priest at Telerad and a tobacco executive in 1960 both technically worked with the same underlying human drive. They have almost nothing else in common. One built a ritual around reverence. The other built an industry around addiction. Same plant family, same ancient instinct, 2 entirely different outcomes depending entirely on what kind of system got built around it. So here's the actual shape of this story, the one almost nobody puts together on screen. This isn't a single timeline that starts with tobacco in the Americas, or even with Homo sapiens sitting around one particular fire in Africa. It's a pattern that repeats itself across species, across tens of thousands of years, across human populations that had zero contact with each other, all arriving independently at the same fundamental conclusion: that certain plants, burned, chewed, snuffed, or brewed, change something inside the body. And that change is worth pursuing deliberately. A Neanderthal in Spain reaching for poplar bark while sick. A priest in the Kingdom of Judah mixing dung into an altar so cannabis smoke would rise slowly instead of burning off. A person in Bronze Age Thailand chewing a nut that left absolutely no visible trace, yet stayed locked inside their teeth for 4,000 years anyway. A shaman in the high Bolivian Andes combining 5 separate compounds inside a pouch made from fox snouts to produce a specific and repeatable altered state. Not one of them read about this in a book. None of them had a word for pharmacology. They watched, they remembered, and they passed it forward, one generation at a time, for what appears to be the entire duration of human and pre-human existence. Researchers who study this pattern across cultures have a name for the underlying idea: the intoxication hypothesis. The basic argument is that the drive to alter consciousness might function almost like a fourth biological drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and reproduction. And it isn't unique to humans at all. Elephants deliberately seek out fermented marula fruit. Reindeer in Siberia have been observed eating a hallucinogenic mushroom and then drinking the urine of other reindeer that already ate it, because the psychoactive compounds passed through mostly intact. If that drive runs this deep enough to show up in elephants, in reindeer, in a completely separate human species that went extinct 40,000 years ago, then maybe the real story here was never really about tobacco at all. Tobacco was just the version that happened to survive into written history with the clearest paper trail. The actual behavior, the underlying instinct to seek out a specific plant because you learned, through direct experience passed down for generations, that it changes something inside you. That instinct might be older than fire itself, older than language, quite possibly older than our own species. So here's what I actually want you to walk away with. 3 completely disconnected ancient societies, separated by oceans and thousands of years, with absolutely no way to compare notes, all landed on the same discovery independently. And a different species of human, one that no longer exists, appears to have gotten there first. Is that really a habit humanity slowly picked up somewhere along the way? Or is it something closer to instinct, wired into whatever it actually means to be human, or even wired into whatever it meant to be a hominin in the first place, something none of us were ever taught, only ever remembered, generation after generation, around a fire? And here's the strange part that ties all of this directly back to the present, whether you smoke, vape, drink coffee, or do none of it at all. The specific substances have changed constantly across every culture and every era. Cannabis in one shrine, betel nut in another burial, coca and ayahuasca compounds in a fox snout pouch, poplar bark in a Neanderthal's aching jaw. But the underlying behavior, choosing to deliberately alter your own internal state using something the natural world provides, hasn't gone anywhere at all. It just keeps finding new containers. A vape pen in a pocket today is, structurally, doing the exact same job as a heated stone in a Scythian tent, or a snuffing tube carved with human hair braided into it in the Bolivian highlands. Different chemistry, wildly different cultural weight, same basic human impulse running underneath it. Once you see that pattern, you can't really unsee it, and it makes the modern version of this story feel a lot less like a bad habit humans invented recently, and a lot more like the latest chapter in something that's been running quietly in the background of our species, and possibly other species of human, for longer than anyone can actually date with confidence. Which is really what separates this video from the ones you've already watched. Most of them treat this like a closed case. Tobacco was discovered, ritual followed, colonization spread it, end of story. What the last few years of actual research keep showing over and over in completely unrelated corners of the world is that the case was never closed at all. A shrine sat unidentified for 50 years until someone finally ran the right lab test on it in 2020. A burial in Thailand looked completely ordinary until someone checked the plaque instead of the enamel in 2025. A fox snout pouch sat cataloged for over a decade before anyone scraped its interior in 2019. Every one of those discoveries changed the accepted timeline the moment it happened, and there is absolutely no reason to think we've found everything there is to find. Somewhere right now, in a museum drawer or a sealed evidence bag from a decades-old excavation, there is very likely another piece of this exact same story, sitting quietly, waiting for the right question and the right piece of equipment to finally reveal what it's been holding on to the entire time. That's the version of this story nobody else has given you, and a good chunk of the evidence behind it didn't even exist publicly until the last few years, sitting quietly in academic journals and museum storage rooms waiting for the right test to finally get run on it. If you want to be watching when the next update like this surfaces, subscribe now, because there will absolutely be more of this. And before you go, tell me honestly in the comments, out of everything in this video, the shrine in Israel, the teeth in Thailand, the fox snout pouch in Bolivia, or the Neanderthals in Spain, which one actually surprised you the most?